Thank you so much for joining us again for our January 1st webinar of 2024. And I'm so excited, really. This is a personal choice for me to have Professor Moira Plant join us today. Moira is one of the most respected figures in the FASD community, not only for the work that she has done to lead us to where we are now with the work that is going into FASD and the work that is going into the understanding of FASD and the birth mother's situation as well. But it's also about the research and the data that has been collated to be able to get us where we are. She is also one of the leading figures in mentoring the next generation of clinicians, researchers, PhD students. And for that, I am absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you tonight, Moira. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's funny how you don't recognize yourself when people introduce you.
You're not the first to say that. Listen, one of the things I've really taken a pleasure in was when I was researching your material and your archive of work and listening to you in the past, I really got a sense that your journey and your vocation has been steered towards the most marginalized groups in society. And tell me if I'm wrong here, but it felt to me that your work as a social scientist and a psychotherapist has been really to get a greater understanding of those areas of community, to be able to educate those that really make assumptions upon those people. And I felt that that was really, it seems to be one of your great vocations in life. Would you agree with that?
I think that's right. I think one of the issues when you invited me onto this, and thank you, was looking back at my history, my path, if you like, in this. And it made me realize how old I was. It made me realize how long I'd been around, really. And so, of course, I had to write something down because otherwise I was going to forget it all. And I guess it really started, I started professional life as a general nurse, but then very quickly went into psychiatry because I enjoyed the idea that you didn't use drugs as therapy, you used yourself as therapy. And that to me was that connection, was that real, and it's an intimacy with people that you get in very, very rarely in other situations, really. And I, in terms of alcohol, I started out as the ward sister in charge of the alcohol treatment unit in Edinburgh.
And that was in 1972, wasn't it?
Oh, shoot.
Sorry, I'm not.
No, you're right. You're right. It was that time.
I think one of the really important things there, though, is that in 1972, there was a really different attitude towards alcohol, wasn't there? And it's really important for everybody to understand that.
But what is interesting when you say that is true, but the issue of judgment of women, of morality of women, of stigma attached to alcohol in women has been a thread that has run throughout centuries. So although alcohol consumption levels have changed, not changed in pattern in this country, but they've changed in levels, that's been the common thread throughout it all.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that if I may. I'm going to come back to that if I may. One of the things that when I touched on the empathy that you had for those marginalized groups, can you tell me a little bit, where did that come from? You know, was that from your youth, from your parents? Where did you find that? Or when did you discover that?
It came from some of my early life experiences of finding the most safe place to be as being able to read people very carefully.
Interesting.
And I think that's what took me into psychiatric nursing rather than staying in general, was that issue of actually connecting with somebody. I was never actually interested in being a doctor. People used to say to me, you know, but I never felt doctors got to know their patients the way that the nurses did. You know, they didn't spend as much time, but that was not a criticism of them. They didn't spend as much time with them. They tended to be of a different social class.
Yeah.
And from nurses, and therefore from many of their patients. And so that in itself, I think, was one of the important bits. And I think, you know, when I look back, I had huge learning curves as well. I mean, when I worked in the alcohol treatment unit, women were not treated the same as men. Interestingly enough, often treated worse by the female staff.
Really?
You seem to feel that they were letting the side down.
Yeah.
And when I think back, I cringe at some of the things. We would have people in the outpatient clinic, people coming in for appointments, and they would give a woman an appointment for 9 o'clock in the morning. No one asked what her home circumstances were. No one asked if she had children that she had to get out to school. By definition, because it was an alcohol treatment unit, some of these children would have had FASD. But at that time, it wasn't even on the radar.
No.
And we would sit there in our smug little offices and interpret it as them not really wanting to be committed to their treatment because they couldn't, you know, they were saying, well, 9 o'clock in the morning, it's not really easy. All we really needed to do was say to them, what's the best time of day for you to come in?
Yeah.
But
Now,
it didn't happen.
you've done a lot of research, haven't you, into the history of women and alcohol?
Yeah.
And I'm interested in this as well, because you come up with some fantastic little anecdotes of really going back far in time to understanding. Just before we came on, you mentioned a few. Tell us a little bit about some of the history behind women and alcohol.
Well, it's been long.
Yes.
It's been, in the main, judgmental. It's about morality. It's about how men saw women. And for centuries, women were simply the furniture of men. You know, women had no power on their own. They didn't, if they wanted to leave an abusive drinking husband, they couldn't take the children with them. They had no money of their own because all their money went to the man when they got married. And really, that was one of the reasons, certainly in the States and to some extent here, where the original feminist movement started.
Yeah.
You know, it was about how women could escape dangerous men and still hold on to their property. And that was really, if you look back over some of the original recordings, and they're wonderfully expressive, of the women in America who started out the first women's movement. They are so passionate about wanting women to have their own rights. They actually wrote, there's in the American Declaration of Independence, the women actually wrote a woman's Declaration of Independence. Because from then until the 70s, even in the alcohol research world, if women and men were both interviewed in research projects, they were not analysed by gender.
Really?
So everything that happened really focused on men.
Yes.
And that led to policy decisions for men. That led to treatment services designed for men. It meant that women who had children at home and perhaps were on housing benefit, if they were asked to go into treatment, so our treatment in the alcohol unit, for instance, was an initial 2-week detox and then an intensive 12-week course. If a woman agreed to that, she would lose her housing benefit. Who would look after the children if there wasn't a man there? And, you know, but all along, women have been second-class citizens. And it's like that in almost every area in terms of women, and not just alcohol. But it is this interesting bit that even now, where equality is getting there, we're far from equality yet.
Yeah. But
it's closer than it's been for a long time, although in some countries, some politicians are not making that easy anymore. If you look at it, the way that women have been second-class citizens means even if they have the same opportunities as men now, they are still less than, if that makes sense. You know, for a long time, I think probably up until the 70s in this country, a single woman would find it very difficult to get a mortgage.
Yes.
So, you know, when you look at it like that, from very early on, the only women who actually did quite well were women who ran a pub with their husbands and the husbands died. The women could then take over the pub. And we know from early on and from many countries, many of the African countries, the women controlled the alcohol because they made it. And they also made the pots that the alcohol was carried in. And if you go to some of the shebeens in places like South Africa and Uganda, the women still control the behavior.
Interesting.
And that has been really important. And one of the major changes in this country with young women is that young women are now behaving in the same way as young men. They're getting drunk. They're not ashamed of it. And for many, many years, a woman who got drunk was ashamed of it. She did not boast about it.
Mm.
And she also felt unsafe. The reason that women used to give in the 50s, 60s, and 70s for not getting drunk was they needed to be in control. It was too risky. That's gone out the window.
Mm.
And so the women who used to be the sort of informal social controllers of male drinking are no longer there for that purpose. Not necessarily an ideal purpose, but it did control the men. The only people that can now control are the police, and that's not a great situation for anybody. And it's certainly not a great situation for the police.
Yeah, least of all the police.
Yeah.
So you've got this journey. It started with you in Edinburgh at the alcoholism treatment unit.
Mm-hmm.
You were a ward sister, weren't you, there? Where did that lead you? What were your experiences there that took you to your PhD, if you like?
Well, I got pregnant. I was interested in women and alcohol. I was well aware that women were treated differently. And that was that sort of almost hypervigilance, empathy thing that you spoke about earlier. Mm. And I think I was surprised and worried by the way that some of the female staff treated the women. I decided to have a life. I met my husband. I became pregnant. And then one of the other things that's been consistent in my life is I make links between things. Sometimes way out in space links.
Right.
And that's been one of the interesting things about the psychotherapy and the researcher hats that's allowed me to link things in sometimes when these discrete populations don't. But I started to read about drinking in pregnancy. This would have been 77, 78. Still not a lot on the radar. And after I had our daughter and looked for money for a survey on drinking in pregnancy, I remember writing to a very distinguished alcohol psychiatrist in England who had apparently done some research. This was before Google and emails and things. And I explained to him this, idea I had. And he said, no, I've done that. It's not worth it. There's nothing there.
Really?
Don't bother. Now, the one thing is he didn't know me. So he didn't know that if someone says to me, don't bother,
yes,
that's exactly where I'm going. So I set up this project. Looking back, if I'd known now what I didn't know then, I don't know if I would have done it. But I trained interviewers, got all the politics of the local antenatal clinics in order, and started a survey of 1,000 women in Edinburgh. Interviewed them about their drinking, about a whole load of other things, including their drug use and their medicines. One of the things that I always find interesting is the language. People, if you ask a lot of the general population if they use drugs, if they are on any drugs, they interpret that as illegal drugs.
yes.
You have to use the word medicines. And then you have to ask them if they're using the medicines the way they're supposed to, or whether they're using them differently. So, you know, I think sometimes it's easy to become careless with things, and yet those details really are important.
Mm.
An interesting study in that one of the questions was, are you drinking more or less or about the same than before you became pregnant? And a lot of the women were saying, thankfully at that point, a lot of the women were saying they weren't drinking as much. Main reason was they'd gone off the taste. They were about 12 weeks pregnant. This was a first antenatal clinic. Halfway through the study, they changed their explanation to, I don't think it's good for the baby. Now, it didn't change the number of women who reduced their drinking. All it changed was their reason for doing it.
Mm.
And when I looked back, there was a program on at the time called Dallas.
Yes.
And Sue Ellen in Dallas was pregnant, and she was also drinking very heavily.
Right.
And the obstetrician had been very clear with her, not a good idea. And it was just at that point that the women started changing their reason for reducing their drinking from, I don't like the taste, to, it's not good for the baby. So I think there is something in there about television being able to work.
Actually, I mean, this is something that it brings me on to another area that you've done some research in as well, and that is in how television and marketing and adverts and advertising through the years really does influence how and why women might drink and the reasons behind that. So, you know, it ties in really well with that, doesn't it?
And I mean, historically, you know, some of the first tobacco ads encouraging women to smoke were designed by Freud's nephew in America.
No, I
So
didn't know that.
you know, people use the learning they get from different aspects of professional groups to, for good or ill, to impact on other areas.
And actually, one of the things you were talking about there was the questions that you ask. That's such an important point. We've, you know, our listeners will be aware of the nice guidance that came in for FASD last year. And one of the really important questions there was the need to be able to access the relevant information on the mother drinking during the pregnancy. With that, you can get a confirmed diagnosis if there are other related conditions. Now, when we talk to many of our birth mothers, when you talk to many of our parent carers on our support groups, and you say to somebody, how much have you been drinking during pregnancy? Oh, none, because you know that there's something about that you should not be saying. How much chocolate have you been eating? None. No, I haven't had any chocolate. And your instinct is to do that. And so asking the question in a different way. I know talking to some of the community pediatricians now, they're talking about saying, well, first of all, let's get an idea of what the lifestyle was like before, because that's not threatening. And so, as you said earlier, the way that we ask the question or the wording is so crucial, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, when I first went to the local antenatal clinics to get permission to carry out the survey, I was listening to one of the obstetricians, and he said he did ask women about alcohol. And at that time, that was pretty impressive. They asked about diet, they asked about smoking. Smoking was the major one. And I was listening to him, and he got to the drinking bit, and he said, you don't drink, do you? That was it.
Yeah. And
to actually say, well, actually, I do a little, I do drink a little, would have been almost impossible for the woman. So it's, but I think one of the difficulties is, and there's now been quite a lot of work done in the UK on this, some very good work. But one of the difficulties is you have to take on board the midwife, the woman, and the setting. And you also need to take on board the external and the internal aspects of the midwife, the external and the internal aspects of the woman and the setting. So you ask a woman in a busy clinic about what she's drinking. And if you don't like the idea of a woman drinking, you go, really? And the one thing that's guaranteed is our body language and our facial expressions will give us away long before our words.
Mm.
And I think that for me, and yes, it's with the psychotherapy hat on, I think one of the aspects of nurse training that is really important is self-exploration. And for centuries, when nurses didn't do that, nurses were held in very high esteem at that point.
Yes.
You know, when I was a nurse and I wore the sort of traditional uniform with the, you know, the starched apron and everything, women, nurses were highly respected.
Mm.
Things
My
are
aunt was
changing.
a sister, and she was absolutely like a headmistress, and everyone was afraid of her.
Yeah.
You know, all the nieces, nephews, everyone.
Mhm.
But yeah, absolutely. But she was held in such high regard.
Yeah. Yes, I remember the night sister in one of the hospitals I worked in, and we all the night staff had got together because we were so fed up with this woman complaining about us. We had done everything perfectly, and the reason she was annoyed was the starch in our aprons was making too much noise and disturbing the patients. She had to find something that was wrong. But I think that, you know, in the FASD field, that one of the interesting things about it is there is a history, and there is debate within the history. You know, when you look back at those original work, the work that Christy Ulliland did, that everyone forgets her name when they talk about Smith and Jones and Stryskooth. Christy Ulliland was the one who first found these children. 10, 11 women, all on welfare. I don't think they even asked about other drugs. What was consistent was the way the babies looked. And then the social scientists came in and did some work. And you began to get this debate between the East Coast of America and the West Coast, because the National Institute for Alcohol and Alcohol Abuse gave quite a lot of money in the 70s to do this. And one of our friends, Ralph Hinkson, headed up the study with Henk Rosette in Boston. And Ralph was staying with us, and I very tentatively handed him the results from my study, because I really wasn't finding anything. I wasn't. Actually, the women weren't drinking very much, looking back, but, you know. And he says, you're finding the same as everybody else. And I said, well, wait a minute. He said, no, the difference is the interpretation of the results. Now, the East Coast were social scientists, the West Coast were medics. The East Coast were male, the West Coast were female. And that clash caused a lot of problems within the field. West Coast, very clear, women shouldn't drink when they're pregnant. East Coast, social scientists, looking from a much wider picture of alcohol, we're saying, well, let's look, you know, what else is attached to this? Not every woman who drinks has a baby that's damaged. Not every woman who's got a drinking problem has a baby that's damaged, which is true. So, you know, they were wanting the complexity. The medics wanted absolutely clear. And of course, public health messages can't be complex.
Yes.
But you know, from the very beginning, there have been debates in the field.
So let's go back, if we may, to your PhD. It was quite groundbreaking in a sense, the fact that I know when we look at prevalent studies today that we're desperately trying to get as much information as we can. Your data, it had huge amounts of people for a PhD. How did you manage that?
Because I was naive, I think. We had 1,000 women interviewed at 12 weeks. At 34 weeks, we re-interviewed 3 subsamples: abstainers, light drinkers, moderate to heavy drinkers. We followed up the 1,000, and all the babies were examined within 24 hours of birth. And then at 12 weeks, at 3 months, all the babies were examined for developmental issues by the health visitors. It was massive. It was massive.
It's a huge amount of work.
And it's one of my difficulties. And I have to be very careful when people say, well, we interviewed 3 people. And I'm thinking, you know, and I'm not saying it's not important to interview 3 people. And actually, I think that we're now at a point where the qualitative studies can inform the quantitative questions that are asked, and vice versa. So it's beginning to marry together in a way that it wasn't to start with. but it was, yes, it was important. It
But
was important.
where did you then go with your PhD? Where did that take you?
It took me to a book, and then it took me to moving back to women and alcohol again, because that was the first issue. It was about, I was a feminist. I didn't believe that women were being treated well. And then I did a study on nurses and AIDS and alcohol and drugs. Studies on the sex workers, the sex industry, both women, men, and the clients.
All those marginalized parts of society.
Yeah.
Really, you felt passionate about. Yeah.
Yeah. And well, I hate that expression, giving the voice, but actually that's what it was doing. It was making clear that, you know, people, and then the AIDS took over, and I guess we got involved with Bill Darrow at CDC, who became a very good friend. And Bill was one of the first people to identify that tracing of people who were HIV positive.
Right.
Martin, my husband, went to the WHO in Geneva to help them set up and design their AIDS research program. And then I moved on again, met Susan Flesher about that time.
Right.
Amazing woman. And we just connected.
Yeah.
And then I was working with a woman, Sharon Wilsnack, who was an alcohol researcher in the States. And we were really getting annoyed at the way that all this work was being done, and yet the gender was not taking part of the analysis. And we really felt we needed to do something about that. So we set up with other colleagues a project called GENACIS, Gender, Alcohol and Culture. And it took off. I think by the time it finished, there were 40 countries involved. We asked women and men about their drinking, because we wanted to compare within each country what genders were drinking. It was fascinating. It was a very important study. And again, it was done very carefully. We designed the questionnaire. We got it translated into the language of the country it was to be used in. And then we got it back translated by somebody else to make sure it still held the same sense.
So the wording, again, it was relevant.
Absolutely.
Yes. In every language, yeah.
It was the wording, it was the sense, not necessarily the wording. So if you were in a country that had no cars and you traveled by canoe, the question was not, have you ever driven a car when you've been drinking? The question was, have you ever been in a canoe when you've been drinking? So although the words were different, the sense was the same.
So what sort of countries were you dealing with? Because I know that it was, didn't you have the funding from the European Union at the time?
That was one of the people we got funding from. And I got also got funded by the Amsterdam Group. And that caused a lot of problems, because the Amsterdam Group was a drinks industry.
Right.
The original study was funded by the Wellcome Trust. The GENACIS study was funded by the Amsterdam Group. I think one of the best things about the GENACIS project was it enabled people like Sharon and myself and some other colleagues from countries where surveys and epidemiology were part of the common knowledge, to buddy up with people in countries who had never had that in their history. So some of the African countries, Uganda, Nigeria, Turkestan, you know, all over the world. So it was a mixture of different things. And some of them were comparable, some of them weren't. But a lot of it was actually about training people in doing good survey work.
Right.
And showing where, in countries where perhaps different countries that had a similar drinking pattern, ones who were further ahead in terms of service provision for problem drinkers could provide that information to the ones who were seeing the development of a heavy drinking population and hadn't yet got to the service provision. So it was a way of training people. It was a way of supporting people. Sharon used to say it was a family, and she was right. You know, it was a very, I mean, I remember talking to one of the people in one of the African countries who was very anxious because he'd got money to take weight and height were the two of the things we did, so we could do BMI. If you live in a country where when you ever go to a hospital, you don't know what weight you are.
Yeah.
And the only way you can measure your height is if the researcher knows what height they are and they stand beside you and you try and guess it.
Right.
So, you know, it had to be creative.
Yeah. Different rules, different. Yeah.
Absolutely. The interesting thing was I was the UK lead for the UK lead for the GENACIS project. What we found, and it was the first time it had been found, was the women were drinking massively more than they had in the 80s. And actually, when you looked at it, the people who were drinking most were the men in Scotland, and then the women in Scotland, then the men in England, and then the women in England. So the women in Scotland were drinking more than the men in England. At that point, I got linked back into the drinking and pregnancy stuff, because if they were drinking that much more in a high-risk behaviour pattern, what people now call binge drinking, but we've always drunk that way in the Northern Europe, then there were going to be consequences. And it took me back into the pregnancy issue again.
And what did you look for when you got back into the pregnancy issue then? You know, you found these shocking statistics now, and you're thinking, right, okay, do you think, what difference can I make? Or do you think I need to find why this is so? What's your reasons? Where's your brain working on that?
I think for me, I needed to try and find out why. And one of the bits that was really important to me was to ask people questions about positive reasons why they drank. Now, that was actually quite, at the time, that was quite a sensitive issue. But with my psychotherapy hat on, I knew if you sat in front of someone asking about a behavior, and the only questions you asked were what the problems were with that behavior, they were eventually going to say, this woman must think I'm really stupid. And so they start twisting the truth of it. It's human nature. It's not women and men behave in exactly the same way. It's not a devious thing. They just, well, no, it's not as much as that, you know. So I would train people and say, ask what's your favorite drink? And then say, how much do you drink? If they said whiskey, I would say 3 bottles. Because it's always much easier to say, oh, no, it's nothing like that, to say half a glass.
Yes.
And they say, well, actually, it's a bit more than that. And it was interesting because a long time before that, there was a study carried out in the States, and they asked social drinkers why they drank. They asked problem drinkers why they drank. And they asked problem drinkers who had had treatment and were now abstainers. And the social drinker said, I do it because I enjoy it, it makes me feel good. The problem drinker said, I do it because I enjoy it and it makes me feel good. And the people who'd had treatment and were abstaining then said, I did it because I enjoyed it, it made me feel good. That was the key. There were massive other reasons. And then, of course, the drink took over and they developed problems in their marriage and their work and their finances. But at the beginning, it was all the same. We do it because it makes us feel good. And now, if you don't understand that, you've got a problem.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting. I think looking at your work throughout your journey, I find one of the most fascinating features has been the fact that your work as a epidemiologist and as a psychotherapist, the two, how they marry.
Yes.
I can see the value of that. Can you explain how you found that to be a very useful, you touched on it there, but can you give us some other examples of how that combination has been so valuable for you in your research and work?
It's an interesting question. My first response to that is it made me help people who were anxious about and not confident in carrying out studies. So I became the person that people would come to.
Yeah.
Because, again, with a psychotherapy hat on, they weren't going to be judged. You know, and so I didn't have the rigidity that some researchers have about needing it to be absolutely clean. I would say, I think, in fact, to one of the people in the African countries, I said, okay, so we can't do BMI, we can't work out height and weight, but we could, if you know what height you are, we could guess, or we could do it as well as possible. But it allowed me to say to Sharon, and you know, this is not a very robust measure. We can't really put a lot of weight on that in that country. So I think it allowed me to be the support person for that survey.
Yeah.
And I think I still am in that role. I think
Yes.
that's the bit that I see I'm in now more than before, actually.
And I think that's what makes you a very good mentor as well. But it also, it meant that when you are listening to data, you mentioned the East Coast and the West Coast, the disparity between the two, and yet you understood both. You could understand a degree of both. And that gave you an opportunity, probably put you in a very good position to be able to say, well, actually, we've got to understand both of these. There's a reason for both. And I would imagine that that put you in a really good position to then be a guider, if you like, or lead the way in some of the thinking. You had the people behind you, people trusted you. And so therefore you were able to lead the way and pioneer, if you may, some ideas and suggestions. Can you tell us how that then took you, you know, your work with GENACIS, where did that then take you?
Well, it in some ways it took me back to the FASD field in that I became, my daughter went to University of British Columbia for an exchange year. She told them that she wanted to explore local tribes, and actually what she wanted to do was snowboard. And she became a professional snowboarder while she was out there. But at that point, I met Jan Lutke, who is still my star, CJ, one of the adults with FASD, Chris, oh gosh, mine's gone a blank. A lot of the people in the field, clinicians and people who were carers and who were living with FASD. And I also met people like Ed Riley and, you know, Ken Jones, and it allowed me to, and one of the things I think I still do is it allowed me to get a wide range of colleagues that allowed me to put people in touch with each other who were doing different things. And again, that idea of someone who's very experienced in the field mentoring people who are not so experienced. And as I remember, a ward sister in a psychiatric hospital ward once said to me, birds of a feather, you know what a person's like by their friends. So I knew that the people that I made friendships with would be willing to help people who were just starting out. And that has worked.
Yeah, and that's so crucial. Have a good team of people behind you and are surrounding you that you trust and trust you, and you will find your way to where you want to go. Absolutely agree with that. And I think you've absolutely done that in the work that you've looked at. Now, before we introduce people, I wanted to, we spoke about the stigma that is attached and is still attached to today. When I came into the FASD world, I'd been for many years a foster carer alongside my wife. Our speciality was really in autism, and we'd cared for 20 years with children with autism. But then we did a lot of respite. We offered a lot of respite with our family. It worked for our situation, and some very close friends of ours, our founder of the charity FASD Awareness, Tracy, we did respite with one of her young men, and he had FASD. We were given clear instructions of how to manage the behaviors. So the idea of our respite was that it was seamless. There was a great transition, easy transition. That way we would alleviate any stress. That was the important point. Now, we learned a lot about FASD through that connection. However, when I came in to be invited to set up the charity as chair of FASD Awareness, I did my research. And I hold my hand up, and I'm not proud of this at all, but when I started, first of all, researching it, I had a preconception about why women might drink during pregnancy. And my first thought was alcoholic women. That was my first thought. And I'm glad I had that experience, because then when I met the likes of Pip
Yeah.
Williams, when we did our first film to educate, it was a short film with the brilliant producer and filmmaker Max Blustin. We did a short film that was literally about a minute and a half, and it explained, with the help of Pip Williams, why women might drink during pregnancy. And it had such a powerful impact. Because it had a powerful impact on me, and I felt so strongly about this, it therefore had to have a powerful impact on others. Have you seen people's attitudes towards women and the stigma that is still attached to women who drink alcohol during pregnancy? Do you still see that stigma? Has it changed much in your time?
I don't think so. And I'm saying that with sadness, but I don't think it really has. If you look at people who try and put groups together with foster parents and birth mothers, there's this blame game that happens, and no one benefits from it, although it sometimes makes people feel better for a brief minute that they've had their say and they've told this person what they think. Doesn't make any difference.
No.
And for me, one of the bits that is wonderful when I look at, because the group that I learn most from in all of this is adults with FASD and their carers. There's a reason why we were born with 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that is because we're supposed to listen more than talk. I learn more from them. That wonderful full body experience that the FASD adults carried out online survey, looking at the physical harm that occurs with FASD and the consequences of that. I think birth mothers have a real difficult time. I also truly believe that they will give themselves a harder time than anyone else could.
Absolutely.
But nobody gains by that.
No.
But one of the bits that does worry me, and I was glad to hear you say that you run support groups for care, and the work that you do, which is amazing, is this idea that people focus on the child or the teenager or the adult with FASD. I'm still not sure how much work is done with the woman in terms of how she has got to where she's got. And I think that a lot of women, and I don't mean this in any way critically, I think a lot of women, birth mothers, will put their energy in trying to make things better for the FASD community, but they're still carrying this. And for me, I would like to see far more support for birth mothers. A lot of the people in the FASD community, one of the things that as I said to you earlier, I tend to link things together. And one of the links for me is post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
Now, there's been some good work. Alan Price did some good work in Salford, where there's a lot of good work being done there, and found that if you had people with FASD and people with PTSD, he would focus on the FASD diagnosis rather than the PTSD. But part of the difficulty with PTSD is if it's a baby, they're non-verbal. There's no point in asking them what the experience was because they can't tell you. They don't have the words to say. And what happens is it's the sensations that they experience, and that's what they carry with them. It's made worse with people with FASD who cannot fight back. Those are the people who really suffer from it. A lot of these birth mothers have PTSD.
Yes.
A lot of them.
Absolutely.
And you cannot do psychotherapy in that analytical, verbal way because it doesn't work. There's no point in saying to someone, you're really a very good person, because they don't believe it. And then in their heads, they'll be saying, yeah, but if you really knew me.
Yeah.
They cannot believe it. It's not
deeply entrenched, isn't it? Yeah.
Deeply entrenched. And we don't yet, not that we won't ever, but we don't yet have the sensitivity of questionnaires and instruments to get to that level of harm that people have. And I think PTSD and FASD are closely related. I think that if you look at the history of some of these children, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, when we look at ACEs, adverse childhood effects, and you're going back generations, and the research that's going into that at the moment, I really feel there's the nature and nurture argument that we see as well. As a foster carer, we can spend 20 years looking after an individual, and yet that nature comes through. The one thing that we do find is that they come back and they say to us, okay, so I screwed up, and it came through, it screwed up, but I do know there's another way. Wonderful. And there's that. Yes. Now, one of the things that I've been very outspoken on, if you may, and that's that you worked with AIDS patients. You've worked alongside people that have worked and contrasted it with the smoking, the work that's gone into smoking. All of these have had national campaigns, and yet alcohol has not had a government campaign. Now, I know you've done a lot of work with the World Health Organization as an advisor for them, to governments, UK governments. Why is it that we still do not have a national campaign around this subject?
Well, we've had education campaigns on alcohol, and the one result from all the evaluations of education campaigns across the world is they don't work.
Right.
The alcohol industry love them because they're saying, look what we're doing. But actually they don't work. With a campaign, what you want is to change someone's knowledge, understanding and behavior. And with health education campaigns, you will increase knowledge and you will increase understanding. You won't change behavior, and it's behavior is the one that you want to change. So I don't think these kind of campaigns are particularly effective. I think if you focus on specific groups, there were some really good campaigns done in Uganda on university students. Big posters, fancy posters about what happens if you drink. But the reality is the vast majority of people drink. They may occasionally get drunk. Some of them never do. I never did, but only because I was a control freak, not because I wasn't a particularly good person, because I wasn't. But you know, that whole idea of people need to know they have power.
Yes.
And they also need to know that they have a right, for me anyway, and it was the same with condoms and AIDS. You have a right to decide yes or no, but whatever you decide, you have to also accept the consequences. And I think that's the bit that is really difficult. Humans are complex creatures. We really are complex creatures. That's what to me is so fascinating as a psychotherapist. You know, people will have the same life experiences, but they will respond very differently, partly because of the family they come from, partly because of the support. Massive 2,000 children study on PTSD in the States a few years ago, looking at reasons why it happened. That something like 59% of the children said it was because they'd been bullied, humiliated, and they were invisible. After that came sexual abuse, physical abuse, war, terrorism was one of the issues. But they were invisible. Now, if you look, and again, I'm looking at serious drinking, that's what happens with these children. They don't get heard. They don't get looked at. They don't get the facial expressions. They don't get the love. It's all non-verbal stuff. And I think we do everybody a disservice by not acknowledging that the non-verbal aspects of all our behavior has an impact on our relationships, whether we're health professionals or the rest of us. Health professionals are first and foremost human beings.
Yeah.
And we have all the flaws that human beings have.
I think as a musician, I can completely concur with that.
Yes, yes.
And I knew I'd love talking to you. What I'd like to know now is really, what are you excited by at this point in the journey? Let's look at what are you excited by in the FASD community at the moment?
I think I am excited by the aspects like links with PTSD. I think the work that's being done on epigenetics is interesting. I think that that some of the work that's being done in Canada on epigenetics is interesting. I do think that we have to explore the impact on a young person with FASD in their community by working with the people in their community. For me, the people who often get left out are the siblings.
Yeah.
The ones who sit there and say, how come you tell me once not to do something, and if I do it again, you yell at me? And with him, you tell him again and again and again and again, and you're so patient. What's the difference?
Yeah.
And, if you talk to siblings of people with FASD, they will say it's really difficult. It's so frustrating because we don't understand it. And that, to me, one of the wonderful things to me about talking with people, young people with FASD, is so many of them accept not with their birth mothers anymore. My birth mother didn't do this intentionally. They can forgive.
Yeah.
No.
That's exactly
For adults.
That's exactly what we hear. Yeah. I totally agree. Sorry to interrupt you there. This is one of the things with a lot of the adults that have FASD that come on to our webinars. Every one of them says, I don't blame them. I really don't blame my birth mother. And I think that is so telling. And I'd like to go back as well to talk. You brought up about the siblings. I'd also add into that some of the children who foster as well, because there's a large community of fostering. And we support, when we do our family activity days, one of the great side benefits that we discovered, and as a result we are setting up a sibling support group as well, was that we'd be talking to some of the siblings and they'd be going, do you know what, I've really enjoyed today. I've really enjoyed it because I haven't had to be anxious about him. I haven't been embarrassed by his behavior, because everyone's like this today. And also I'm talking to other people that understand this. And I think the impact on them, one of the things I've noticed through my own 2 birth children with fostering, and I said to you before we came on air, was that they have a level of empathy that my parents, who were very anxious about us, we started fostering before we had children, and that was our choice. And they grew up with fostering. And our 2 birth children, my parents were very anxious about this, and they let us know about it too. And yet years later, my father, in credit to him, said, do you know what? I take it all back. He said, watching your 2 children, they have a level of empathy that you cannot teach. And I said, do you know what? I totally agree with that, but I don't know later in life what impact that's going to have on them as well. And we make the best choices we can in those situations. And I think there is that empathy that birth children and siblings have. And I think it's very important to be able to have them in the conversation as well. Absolutely. Thank you for drawing that attention.
I absolutely agree with that. I think the bit for me that part of the complexity, and as you will registered by now, complexity fascinates me. One of the things for me is it can be very difficult for siblings to be as annoyed as they want to be.
Yeah.
And I first came across this, I was talking with some people in the AIDS wards in San Francisco, and they had, some of the staff were HIV positive. and they became ill, so they were off sick, so other staff had to cover. It became extremely difficult for them in a support group to get angry, the staff who did not have HIV, to get angry. But in a sense, they had every right to. They were having to step in and do double shifts. They were the ones, you know. So I think for the siblings, sometimes they have to know it's okay to be angry.
Yes.
What we need to work on is how you release that anger without causing damage to yourself or somebody else.
Yes.
And if that means going for a long walk and squawk and screaming at the top of your head, go for it.
Yeah.
Because once that adrenaline starts, you there's no point in saying, meditate for 20 minutes. And I meditate regularly. I'm not knocking it. Go and have a nice warm bath and candles. It doesn't work. The adrenaline is going through their system and they need to get rid of it. Boxing.
Yeah.
Nelson Mandela said what changed him from being this terrorist, which he was before he was jailed. I mean, he was a very different person when the person came out. Said it was boxing that saved him because he learned he could look after himself. He learned he had to watch what the other person was doing. And he also had to look at how he was going to block that if the person came to him. So boxing did it for him. Got rid of that anger that would just explode.
We find that because we've worked with a lot of autistic children that have, and it works with FASD, a lot of our FASD kids as well, sensory circuits have been the most valuable resource to many families. And it's interesting that my youngest son frequently, if he's getting angry about something, I go in and I hear him banging around. He's doing his own sensory circuit. He's adopted that himself. And I think those strategies that they learn, really important. Absolutely. I'd like to, before we go, because I know, as always, the time is flying by and I've thoroughly enjoyed this, as I knew I would. I would love to be able to talk to you about where we are in the UK now with FASD, because I know you're very influential around the world and you understand where other countries are with FASD. We've been sort of behind Australia, Canada and America for many years, but there is motivation. In Salford, we had that very, very good and fascinating about 20 years journey. And you've been through that 20-year journey. And so where do you see us at the moment in the community, within the world?
I mean, we are, yes, we're slow to catch up with places like North America and Australia. But actually, what's interesting in places like Canada now is some of the money is disappearing.
Yeah.
So, you know, what they had is disappearing, which is worrying.
Yeah.
I think for me, the one of the really important bits is not to lose sight of the drinking and pregnancy, but also to focus on the FASD and to accept, and I think we have to, there is not the money to have discrete FASD clinics. We need to train clinicians, we need to train the nurses. There's the clinic that Raja runs, there's the training that the Foetal Alcohol Advisory team run in Edinburgh, which is now doing amazing stuff. It's actually got one of the first training packs for people around the world with FASD. So in a sense, we can benefit from the work that's been done in these other countries by looking at what's worked and what hasn't and not waste our time on the stuff that didn't. Yeah. While we still have some money going on. But I think that it has to be that discrete FASD clinics are far too expensive. I remember talking to Sterling Claren about this, and he said that's where we have to go. We have to be able to assess people for neurodiversity without and make it all the same, and that might help with the judgmental stuff. You know,
use the existing toolkit and infiltrate from within. Yes,
I think so. I think that's where we have to go.
Well, that fills me with hope. Moira, I have thoroughly enjoyed today. Thank you so much for coming on and educating us all and telling us about your wealth of experience and your journey along the way. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all so much for joining us. Those that have not been to one of our webinars before, please do come and join us on a regular basis. We have them once a month, and it's usually the third Thursday of the month. Put it in your diaries. If you've missed any of our previous ones, we've had, I think, about 20 webinars now that we show the history of our webinars. They're all on our YouTube channel on FASD awareness. So please do go there and take your pick of whatever takes your fancy. Educate yourselves, become better understanders of FASD and the wider community. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, Moira, once again. All the best.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.